Early one morning, Greg Peterson, a 45-year-old white man with a broad, stocky build, was jolted awake by loud commotion next door. Groaning in irritation, he stumbled to the window, yanking back the curtain to investigate. The house next door, long abandoned and a quiet blight on the neighborhood, now had new tenants. Greg's eyes narrowed as he spotted a large, muscular black man unloading boxes from a moving truck. The man, who appeared to be around 40, moved with steady purpose, ignoring the two police officers who emerged from the house a moment later and walked to their car. "What the hell is this?" Greg muttered under his breath. Unable to contain his irritation, he threw open his front door and barked, "Hey, you! Keep it down, will you? It's too damn early for this nonsense." The man stopped, pausing mid-lift with a box in his arms. His calm, unreadable gaze met Greg's. "And while you're at it," Greg sneered, emboldened by the man's silence, "don't make the cops come back and drag you off to jail. Don't think I don't know your type." The man, now revealed as Malcolm Harris, set down the box carefully and straightened. His towering frame and calm demeanor seemed almost unnerving in the face of Greg's hostility. Still, Malcolm didn't respond. He simply resumed his work, stacking boxes on the porch with practiced ease. Greg, feeling triumphant after his outburst, began to turn back toward his house when his gaze landed on a large cardboard box near his property line. Annoyed, he stomped over, kicked it hard, and sent it tumbling into the street. "Get this trash off my property," he shouted. Malcolm finally spoke, his deep voice steady but firm. "Why are you damaging my property?" Greg scoffed, his voice rising. "Your junk was on my side. I should have thrown it in the garbage. You should be thanking me for not doing worse." Malcolm's jaw tightened, his fists clenching momentarily, but he didn't move. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over Greg, who reflexively stepped back. The tension between them was palpable, the kind that could erupt into violence at any second. But then, Malcolm closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and picked up the box. Without another word, he carried it inside, leaving Greg standing there, smug in his perceived victory. "That's right," Greg muttered under his breath as he stalked back into his house. "Knew you'd back down. Probably scared I'd call the cops again." Greg settled into his chair with his coffee, pleased with himself. He didn't see Malcolm's quiet resilience as strength, only as fear. To Greg, Malcolm was just another nuisance, and he relished the thought of asserting dominance over his new neighbor. What Greg failed to realize, however, was that Malcolm's silence was not submission. Malcolm wasn't just a new neighbor. He was a man on a mission. And the storm he was about to bring to Greg's doorstep would change both of their lives forever. Over the next few days, Greg continued to make Malcolm's life difficult. He hurled insults whenever Malcolm stepped outside and went out of his way to invade the man's space. Each encounter ended the same way. Malcolm stayed calm and composed, but Greg interpreted this as weakness. One morning, Greg was taking his trash to the curb when he spotted Malcolm near his garbage bin. Malcolm's large frame was hunched over as he seemed to rummage through the contents. Greg's blood boiled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Greg bellowed as he marched over. Malcolm froze, clearly caught off guard. Straightening, he held up his hands defensively. "I wasn't stealing. I thought I saw something important that got tossed. Figures!" Greg spat, cutting him off. "Trash like you belongs in the trash. Is this what you people do? Dig through other folks' garbage?" Malcolm's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't respond. His lips pressed into a tight line. "Don't bother explaining," Greg yelled, swinging his trash bag with exaggerated force. It struck Malcolm square in the chest, exploding on impact. Coffee grounds, leftover food, and rancid liquid splattered onto Malcolm's shirt. Greg stepped back, sneering. "There! Take your pick, you filthy rat!" For a long moment, Malcolm stood still, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed the mess off his shirt. His face was impassive, but the tension in his jaw betrayed a flicker of emotion. Without saying a word, he gathered the trash and cleaned the area, while Greg stormed back into his house, slamming the door behind him. That night, Greg sat on his porch with a beer in hand, watching Malcolm's house with satisfaction. He chuckled to himself, thinking he had finally put the man in his place. "Maybe now he'll think twice before stepping out of line," Greg muttered. But his sense of victory was short-lived. The next afternoon, as Greg glanced out his living room window, he froze. Malcolm was standing on his porch, holding a pair of binoculars, staring directly at Greg's house. Greg's chest tightened with rage. "That bastard!" Greg growled. Without thinking, he stormed to his gun cabinet, pulled out his shotgun, and marched straight to Malcolm's door. He pounded on the wood with the butt of his gun, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "Open the damn door, you bastard!" Greg shouted. When the door swung open, Malcolm stood there, his expression unreadable. Before he could speak, Greg shoved the barrel of the shotgun against Malcolm's forehead, his voice low and menacing. "You spying on me, huh? Think I won't put an end to this right now?" Malcolm's eyes widened slightly, his hands raising in a gesture of surrender. "I wasn't spying," he said, his voice calm but edged with fear. "I was just watching the birds." "Don't lie to me," Greg interrupted, his finger twitching near the trigger. "If I catch you looking at my house again, I swear I'll blow your damn head off." Malcolm took a long breath, his hands still raised. "I understand," he said softly. "It won't happen again." Greg sneered, his grip tightening momentarily before lowering the shotgun. "You're lucky I'm feeling generous today," he spat. "Don't test me again." As Greg stomped back to his house, he didn't notice Malcolm's expression shift. The fear in his eyes disappeared, replaced by a quiet determination. As the door closed behind him, Malcolm murmured to himself, "It's almost time." Unbeknownst to Greg, Malcolm's calm wasn't fear, it was strategy. Every insult, every blow, every threat was another piece in a larger puzzle. And soon, that puzzle would be complete. Late one evening, Greg was finishing his third beer when he heard a faint noise coming from the living room. His brow furrowed as he set the can down. The neighborhood was usually quiet, especially at this hour. Instinctively, he grabbed his tablet to check the security camera feed. His eyes widened as the grainy image revealed Malcolm inside his house, crouched near the safe in the living room. "That son of a bitch," Greg muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Quietly, he retrieved his shotgun from the cabinet and began making his way downstairs, his footsteps silent against the carpet. He smirked to himself, relishing the thought of catching Malcolm in the act. As Greg approached the living room, something unexpected caught his attention. The basement door. It was wide open, the light inside casting a faint glow up the stairs. A cold wave of panic washed over him. No one was supposed to know about the basement, least of all, Malcolm. Abandoning caution, Greg rushed past the living room toward the basement. His heart pounded as he descended the steps two at a time. The sight that greeted him sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. Malcolm stood in the middle of the room, his phone raised, filming everything around him. The basement was a fully equipped drug operation. Shelves stacked with bags of powdered substances, machines for processing, and even a small corner dedicated to growing marijuana. The operation was meticulous and professional, a far cry from what anyone would expect from the outwardly gruff Greg Peterson. Hearing Greg's footsteps, Malcolm turned slightly, slipping the phone into his pocket. His face was unreadable, but the way his shoulders tensed betrayed his awareness of the danger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Greg snarled, pointing the shotgun directly at Malcolm. Malcolm raised his hands slowly, his calm voice carefully measured. "I didn't take anything. I just—" "Shut up!" Greg roared, taking a step closer. His voice dropped to a menacing growl. "Typical rat, sneaking around, trying to steal what's mine. But you made one mistake. You broke into the wrong house. This house belongs to a drug lord." Malcolm's calm facade faltered, his voice trembling slightly. "Please, Greg, let me go. I won't say anything. I promise." Greg laughed coldly, his eyes narrowing. "I've heard that before. You know what happens to people who make promises they can't keep?" Malcolm didn't respond. He simply stood there, his hand still raised, as Greg's finger inched closer to the trigger. "No one will hear you scream," Greg said, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "And no one will care." Without another word, Greg pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the basement as Malcolm crumpled to the floor, his body still. For a moment, Greg stood frozen, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then he smirked, the adrenaline beginning to subside. "Good riddance," he muttered. "Just another piece of trash." As Greg turned to retrieve a knife from a nearby workbench, preparing to dispose of the body, a strange noise made him pause. A faint shuffling sound came from behind him. He turned slowly, his smirk fading. Malcolm was moving. Blood soaked his shirt, but he pushed himself up with alarming ease, his face twisted in grim determination. Greg stumbled backward, his grip tightening on the shotgun. "What the hell are you?" Malcolm wiped at the blood with one hand, his other pulling a small device from his pocket. A single button press sent a signal, and the sound of sirens filled the air. He locked eyes with Greg, his voice steady and commanding for the first time. "You're done, Greg." Before Greg could react, the basement door burst open, and a team of officers stormed in, their weapons drawn. They shouted commands, forcing Greg to drop the shotgun. He barely had time to process what was happening before they tackled him to the ground and slapped cuffs onto his wrists. "You can't do this!" Greg shouted, struggling against their hold. "That bastard broke into my house! He's the criminal!" Malcolm stood to the side, watching silently as Greg was dragged up the stairs. When Greg caught his eye, his face contorted with rage. "Who the hell are you?" Malcolm stepped forward, his calm demeanor now edged with authority. "Detective Malcolm Harris, head of the Anti-Drug Task Force. We've been watching you for months, Greg. Thanks to you, we've got all the evidence we need." Greg's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You tricked me!" he spat, his voice shrill with fury. Malcolm's expression didn't waver. "And you made it easy. Now it's time to face the consequences of your actions." As Greg was hauled out of the house, the weight of his situation finally sank in. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. Greg Peterson sat in the back of a police van, his wrists cuffed tightly behind his back. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in, but his mind raced with fury and denial. "You can't do this!" he bellowed. "You've got nothing on me. This is entrapment." Detective Malcolm Harris stood nearby, watching as Greg was loaded into the vehicle. His calm, collected demeanor was unshaken by Greg's outbursts. When Greg's gaze met his, the fury in Greg's eyes was almost palpable. "You'll rot for this!" Greg screamed. "You think you've won? You're just another—" "Enough!" Malcolm cut him off, his voice low but commanding. "You've already lost, Greg. The evidence speaks for itself." The ride to the station was agonizing for Greg. Every bump in the road felt like another nail in the coffin of his pride. He had spent years building his drug empire, meticulously hiding his operation behind a facade of suburban normalcy. Yet, it had taken just one man, someone he had underestimated from the start, to bring it all crashing down. At the station, Greg was unceremoniously booked. The charges read like a laundry list of his worst fears: drug trafficking, illegal manufacturing, and the attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. Each word felt like a hammer blow. He glared at Malcolm, who stood outside the holding cell, arms crossed. "You think this makes you a hero?" Greg spat. "You're nothing." Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply studied Greg, his calm gaze unyielding. "It's not about being a hero," Malcolm said finally. "It's about justice, and making sure people like you don't ruin any more lives." As the hours passed, Greg's defiance began to wane. Sitting alone in the cold, sterile cell, he couldn't stop replaying the events that had led to his downfall. He had underestimated Malcolm because of his race, his calm demeanor, and what Greg had assumed was fear. That arrogance had blinded him to the truth. Meanwhile, back at the scene, a team of officers was dismantling the drug operation in Greg's basement. The media had caught wind of the story, and news vans lined the street. Interviews with neighbors painted a damning picture of Greg, a man who had bullied and terrorized the community while hiding his criminal activities in plain sight. Malcolm, however, was not one for grandstanding. He declined most interviews, offering only a brief statement to the press. "Justice has been served. This is a victory for our community, and a reminder that no one is above the law." Later that week, Malcolm stood before his team to receive a promotion. The successful takedown of Greg's operation had been a high-risk mission, and Malcolm's calm, calculated approach had been instrumental in its success. As he accepted the recognition, he spoke not about his achievements, but about the larger battle. "This mission wasn't just about shutting down a drug operation," he said. "It was about showing that prejudice and criminality have no place in our neighborhoods. I hope one day we can live in a world where crime and hate are things of the past." As Malcolm stepped off the stage, his mind wandered briefly to Greg. He didn't feel pity for the man, but there was a flicker of hope that Greg's time behind bars might force him to confront his actions, not just his crimes, but the hatred that had poisoned him. Greg, however, had no such reflections. As he sat in his prison cell, his hatred for Malcolm burned brighter than ever. But no amount of rage or self-pity could change the truth. He had lost. And for the first time in his life, there was no one else to blame. Months passed, and the once quiet suburban street had settled into a new rhythm. The house that Greg had turned into his fortress of crime was now vacant, its windows boarded up, a stark reminder of the man who once terrorized the neighborhood. Malcolm, now promoted and leading a larger anti-drug task force, returned to the community one afternoon for an interview about his mission. Standing in front of the abandoned house, Malcolm took a deep breath. He thought back to the events that had unfolded here, the animosity, the danger, and the final, dramatic takedown. But what lingered in his mind most wasn't the adrenaline or the triumph. It was the question of how someone like Greg could spiral so deeply into hatred and criminality. The journalist beside him asked, "Detective Harris, what do you hope people take away from this case?" Malcolm paused, choosing his words carefully. "This case isn't just about drugs or crime. It's about the assumptions we make about each other. Greg Peterson's downfall wasn't just his greed. It was his prejudice. It blinded him, made him believe he could act with impunity. That kind of hate corrodes everything." He glanced at the house again, its silence almost accusatory. "I hope this serves as a lesson, not just about justice, but about how we treat each other. Change begins when we confront the biases we carry. whether they're subtle or overt. Meanwhile, in prison, Greg sat in the common area, his once imposing frame now slouched in defeat. The power he had wielded over others was gone, replaced by the stark reality of his cell and the cold routine of incarceration. He had refused visitors for months, but one day he was surprised to see Malcolm walk into the visiting area. Greg's lips curled into a sneer. "What the hell are you doing here?" Malcolm sat across from him, his demeanor calm and resolute. "I'm not here to gloat," he said. "I'm here because I believe people can change, even you." Greg barked out a bitter laugh. "Change? Spare me the speech, detective. I know what you think of me." "You don't know anything about what I think," Malcolm replied firmly. "But I do know one thing. You have a choice. You can let this prison break you, or you can use this time to reflect, to become better than the man you were." Greg leaned back, his expression guarded. "And why the hell would you care? After everything?" "Because hate only breeds more hate," Malcolm interrupted. "And I refuse to let your hatred define me, or you." For a moment, neither man spoke. The weight of the conversation hung in the air like a taut rope. Finally, Greg looked away, his jaw tightening. "Get out." Malcolm stood, his gaze steady. "The offer stands, Greg. It's never too late to change." As Malcolm walked away, Greg watched him leave, a flicker of something unnameable crossing his face. It wasn't forgiveness, but perhaps it was the faintest seed of doubt, a crack in the armor of his hatred. Back in the neighborhood, the community began to rebuild. People came together, inspired by Malcolm's message and his actions. The house that had once been Greg's fortress was transformed into a community center, a place for education and outreach programs aimed at preventing crime and fostering unity. Malcolm, though proud of his work, knew his mission was far from over. Standing on the porch of the community center, he looked out over the neighborhood and smiled faintly. There was still so much to do, but for now, this small victory was enough.